there is something to be said of when you lose your mental block, you see the things that were there all along. For me, it was a matter of I had my blinders on, and when I opened my eyes, my culture was all around me.
Are you a TCK, a third culture kid? Then you have to listen to this conversation. Shaheen Suleman is a first generation American East African Indian now living and working as a teacher in Kenya. Shaheen shares the stories of coming to terms with being brown and later being an Indian, even though she grew up in America and East Africa. Apart from navigating life as a TCK, she also shares a journey through different faiths coming into a relationship with Jesus. My name is Louise Kuman, and we welcome Caleb Bannister back as our co host. We have a really special guest today, so I want to ask Caleb to introduce her.
Yeah, it's such a great joy to be here. We have Shaheen, or Miss Shaheen, as her students would call her. I've known her for, I think, about a year, almost 2 years. About 2 years, yeah. And I know her from Arusha, Tanzania, and she is a woman who walks the talk. And it is such a joy. I've been able to know her, like I said, for the past while, and every time we've had conversations, I've always been intrigued, challenged, a lot challenged, and encouraged. And she's fun, and she's really chill. So I think we're going to be in for a really special treat. She is a very big encouragement. And for all those that are listening, I really believe you will find some encouragement from what she has to say.
Yeah, Shaheen,
Amen.
so it sounds like your journey's been across the continents. So where did your journey start, your story start?
Well, it's first of all, it's a real blessing to be here. So thank you so much. I feel extremely honored. One of the things that I thought about was, well, I'm just a person. Why do they want me on there? But then I always say to every other person that I meet that they are so valuable and everything that they have to say could be a blessing to another person. And so um it's just a beautiful opportunity for me to practice and continue, like Caleb says, to walk my talk. So I was born in Kansas in the United States, and
Woo!
yeah, middle of the United States. My parents are East African Indian. They've been in Tanzania in East Africa for several generations, 3 or 4 generations, and I'm first generation American.
Shaheen, you grew up as an Ismaili Muslim. Please tell us more about that.
The Ismaili Muslims are a group of people who follow Islam, very liberal people, and they follow a man, an imam, a leader of the time. And so I was born into that religion, but in Kansas, I there wasn't any of that because we were actually the only brown family on the block. There was a little boy named Eddie whose grandmother was part Native American and part African American, and that was it. So in the 1970s, when Idi Amin was actually taking over East Africa, there was a huge exodus of Ismaili Muslim people that all went to Canada. Well, my parents went to the States and went to college in the States, and that's how I ended up being born in Kansas. Um, yeah, so when I was 9, no, my sister was 9, I was 6 years old and moved to Seattle, Washington, which is where my grandparents happened to be. And at that time, my parents said, "You're Muslim. This is how you pray, and we don't eat pork, and this is your school." And I was a little brown girl in a very, very Caucasian neighborhood. We moved. My parents my parents did their best in the sense that like they really wanted to assimilate. So I think the way that they navigated coming to a new country, coming to America in the 1970s at a time when they were a significant minority in a state in the state that they moved into, they assimilated. and they assimilated fully. We
Yeah.
did not speak our language at home. Um, we did not eat our local food, our traditional food. So I still don't know my mother tongue,
Mm.
and just didn't I don't even eat spicy food. I think that when I was young, my mom may have cooked Indian food, but I don't really remember it. I really remember eating just being all American.
Mm.
And in fact, later on, I was watching an episode of The Cosbys, and I saw this sweater that my dad had worn and a one-piece jumpsuit that Claire Huxtable had worn and the hair that Claire
Jeez.
Huxtable had, and it was
Take
like,
it back. Take
"Oh,
it back.
yeah. This is what my parents did. That's how they coped."
Mm.
And so I actually had a very difficult time. I never really knew how to balance being brown
Mm.
on the outside, but then also being very American on the inside, having two cultures. I never really knew how to balance it. And yeah, I did dive into our religion, the Ismaili religion, when I was young. When I was 6 years old, I mean, I've been a people pleaser,
Mm.
and I really wanted to please my parents, and I did it. I was there, and I prayed, and did all kinds of things in religious education classes. What's sort of significant, well, actually very significant, is that before I went to Seattle, I actually had my neighbor take me to church with her. So I think at the very beginning, somewhere between the age of 4 and 5, before I moved, I learned about God, and I learned
Mm,
about Jesus.
Mm.
And so I think that somewhere in my mind, I always had that in my mind. But then I learned about my new religion, and where they really focused on Jesus is not the Son of God. It can't be. And so
mm.
that was stuck in my head. And so I had a serious aversion.
Mm.
I had a real aversion
Sure.
to seeing Jesus that way. Um, so I really stayed in my Ismaili religion from when I was 6 until I was about somewhere in my teen years. And then I really went everywhere. I went into I studied Catholicism. I was in New Age stuff. I studied shamanism, and then I went in on the Buddha path. Then I spent 6 years meditating deeply,
Mm.
and and the whole time just really searching. And in the meantime, there was a very significant thing that happened outside of a Blockbuster video store, which does not exist anymore. But there was,
I see.
yeah, there was when we used to go to a place and actually rent movies. And I was returning a movie, and I was in the Seattle area. And my story goes back and forth because I was little in Kansas, went to Seattle, and then when I was 12, I came to Tanzania and spent all of my summers from when I was 12 until I was
Mm.
16 in Tanzania, and then actually moved to Tanzania when I was 16, finished high school here, and then I went back to the
Mm.
States. So we're talking Miss Shaheen became a complete third culture kid.
Yeah.
Come
Um,
on.
yeah, I was thinking about two significant things that happened. One of them was outside of at the Blockbuster, but rewind to when I was 8 years old, and I was at school in Seattle, near Seattle, outside the Seattle area. And I remember I had grown up in Kansas. I didn't really recognize the color of my skin because I was just American,
Yeah.
and we lived in a white neighborhood, and we assimilated. And then I was at school, and this person, and it would be very funny if he happened to listen to this, um, Nesby Glasgow, who became an NFL football player. He
Oh, wow.
said to me, he said to me at on the playground, he was like, "You black just like me," and I was like, I'm I'm not black. And I remember now I feel kind of ashamed thinking for having such kind of a reaction, but it was really confusing for me because I didn't know what he was talking about. And
Yeah.
I was 8 years old. He was like, "Why do you think that those people talk to you the way that they do? Why do you think
Mm.
that you're treated that
Mm.
way? Color is color. To them, you're just as black as me." And I can remember the playground, the monkey bars, the sky was gray. There was gravel. I remember the Foursquare unit right beside me. And that was the moment when I realized that the people that I felt like, I didn't look like.
Sure.
And
Wow.
so
Okay.
it was a very deep moment where, you know, you're a kid and you just realize you just don't fit. You
Yeah.
already don't fit. And it's a very sort of that's a difficult place to be. And then when I was in my 20s, after I had gone through all of that, moving to Tanzania,
Mm.
going back to the States, I was outside the Blockbuster. And the way that I dealt with being a brown girl, an Indian woman,
Mm.
well, Indian girl, but American, was just to reject all of the Indian culture
Mm.
and reject what my parents were, the parts of our culture that my parents were trying to give me. I just couldn't balance it. So I did not see myself as Indian at all.
Mm.
I completely rejected it. And I was outside this
Mm.
Blockbuster, and this little man, this old man, looked just like Gandhi,
Oh, I
approaches
know.
me. Yeah, he approaches me and he goes, "You, you're Indian." And I was like, "No." I looked at him. I said, "I'm sorry, I'm not." And I had gotten used to having this conversation, this disappointment, because when I open my mouth, I don't sound like I'm
Yeah.
an Indian person. I'm full on American.
Yeah.
And so I said, "No, I'm not Indian." And he said, "No, you're Indian." I said, "Well, my parents are actually from Africa, but you're Indian." He just kept repeating to me,
Mm.
"But you're Indian."
Yeah.
And
Wow.
I eventually got to it and I said, "Well, my ancestors are from India." And he looks at me very seriously and says, "You're Indian." And I went,
Mm.
"Huh, hmm, I guess I am." And that was the beginning, and I must have been 21. And for the past 20, 21 years later, I'm
Yeah.
still dealing with,
Yeah.
sort of being Indian and yet being very American,
Mm.
but loving my culture. I've finally got to the point over these years of embracing these pieces. And this is who we are as third culture people, whoever these third culture kids that are listening who know what I'm talking about. It's being on the fringes. It's
Mm.
being on the fringes and being able to identify with lots of different types of people and having the ability to be the bridge between different
Yeah.
cultures. And
Mm.
it's the framework of mostly belonging and loving mostly belonging in a lot of places.
Yeah.
So I mostly belong in Tanzania. I mostly belong in the States. And that's a beautiful thing. And actually, I mostly belong in Kenya too
Yeah.
because of my East African roots. When I went to India,
Come on.
it was very interesting
Yeah. Tell us.
because they I had the outfits on
Uh-huh.
and I was walking through the towns, and for a while before I opened my
Mm.
mouth and before I got comfortable, I could sort of get mistaken that I was a local
Mm.
person. But eventually, when people would watch me and see how I moved and
Mm.
see how I spoke,
Yeah.
they were like, "No, no, no, you're not from here."
Yeah.
And actually, once I got comfortable and I was, walking and feeling comfortable in my skin, it was immediate. People knew immediately that I did not belong there.
Mm.
And it was like
Wow.
being in a fishbowl that I belong in but can't swim in.
Yeah.
It's like or something like that. It's
Sure.
like being in the water that you come from and yet not being belonging there.
Able to
And
function, eh?
so, yeah, you
Yeah,
can't really function.
yeah.
I mean, I just had a completely different walk.
Mm,
I would ask people, "Well, how do you know I look literally like that woman over there?"
mm,
And they said, "No, it's how you walk. It is the way you hold your head, the way that you walk, the way that you make eye
mm,
contact with people." So it was really interesting,
Wow.
and I was in rural areas, so that also makes sense. It's
mm,
not like I was in New Delhi. I was on a pilgrimage at the time. Because I had meditated so much, I and my 6 years on the Buddha path, I went on a pilgrimage to visit the sites of Buddha.
mm,
Hmm.
Now, you might ask, but yeah, but she's aren't you Christian? Don't is that I kind of hear some Christian things. Yes, I
Yeah.
am. I love Jesus. And it's a beautiful thing to be able to say
What?
that. Yes, I do.
Nice.
He's my king and my Lord and my savior, and I love being able to say that on to the world
mm,
and say it in a place of, I have grappled in so many things, and I have
Hmm.
tried every single way to find
mm.
peace. And
Hmm.
Jesus is the way that I understand peace and can actually experience the love of God. So, how did I lose my aversion to Jesus, right?
Can you, before we get to that, can I
Yeah.
quickly ask, just before
Yeah.
we carry on, oh, I wanted to ask, so did you, when you realized the fact that you're Indian, did you do some, were you more intentional about trying to discover your cultural identity in a ways? How did you go about it, or you just were more open to it?
I think that there is something to be said of when you lose your mental block, you see the things that were there all along.
Yeah,
And so for me, it was a matter of
Hmm.
I had my blinders on,
yeah,
and when I opened my eyes, my culture was all around me.
mm,
And there are I have cookbooks from my grandmother. I would think about
Hmm.
how I spent time with my grandmother sitting on the counter while she was making chapatis on the stove, and how she would teach me, how to make it perfectly round, and how when you flip it over, you use the cloth, and this is how you can puff it up, and just the smells of curries,
mm,
and most of the time culture does revolve around food and clothing
yeah, it's true.
and those are things that were with me the whole time. They really were. They were with me the whole time. I just didn't really notice
Yeah.
them. And I began to appreciate music in a different way, begin to start watching
Hmm.
movies and try to listen in for the language
Mm.
and things like that. So the immediate thing
Did
was
you watch a lot of Bollywood?
not a lot, no. Um the movies are 3 hours long. And
Yes.
Yeah.
and they're amazing. I just have and I will say even now I don't watch a lot of movies. It's just something that I don't just sit down and
Mm.
do. But there are some classics that I did catch up on. I don't remember what they're called now. I remember watching Raja Hindustani, and I actually watched that. Yeah, I watched that with with my cousins. Um, and it was amazing. And
Mm.
I thought, wow,
Wow.
those are my people, you
Mm.
know?
Yeah, that's
Something
awesome.
something that you said that I really like is when you were speaking about at the Blockbuster,
Yeah.
and that man that approached you. I think so many of us in our own story, um, we have those individuals who God puts in our path,
Yeah.
who we really have no idea who they are, and they come and they just they if some could say it's like an angel. They come and they'll just say something very deep and significant, and then we never see them again.
Mm.
For your case, it was a little version of Gandhi, and I think that moment where you have someone who he's actually calling out part of your original design,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we have seen, and I think that is something that's so significant. I've had that in my life when I've had people. bits and pieces that will just say, "Oh, but this is who you are,"
Mm.
when I clearly don't relate to it. Shaheen,
Yeah.
as you know, Luis, Shaheen speaks better Swahili than me. Actually, she's fluent. And
I'm
let me
sure.
tell you something. I remember we were having coffee one time, and and I remember I asked her something like, "Oh, why don't you speak?" And she said, and this just goes to show about the type of woman that she is, of honoring. She's like, "Oh, I don't." She didn't say it in a boastful, cocky way, but she was just like, "Oh, I don't want to speak Swahili in front of you." She said it in a really polite way, but it's just like, because she knew I didn't speak it fluently. Very, even she knows I don't even speak it barely. But she's like, in the sense of like, I don't want to make you feel bad. But it was a really polite way. I don't know if you remember. I remember
I
very clearly.
I have
Um,
no recollection of that.
yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah. But
amazing.
anyways, basically, it's I was blown away because I'm like, wait, do you speak fluent Swat? And she's like, yeah. But anyways, all that being said, when I talk about that man that spoke into her life, I've had people who have done the
Mm.
exact same thing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's kind of one of those things where it's like, it's very humbling, but it's also like, all right, thank you, God, once again
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
reminding me who I am.
I did not
Yeah,
appreciate it at the time.
Yeah.
I was so annoyed.
yeah.
I remember. I mean, but I can still
How dare
see
you?
it. How
You don't
dare
know me.
he? How? But he
Yeah.
wouldn't give up. He was literally pointing his finger at me. This old man, like, and I think he had a cane too. It's so out of a
Come on
movie,
now. Yeah.
but I'll never forget it. And it was the beginning of
Hmm.
of me integrating part of who I am, that or accepting part
Yeah.
of who I am that
Yeah.
I was rejecting.
Yeah.
So yeah.
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 Ah, it's beautiful. And I think it really just opened the door to a whole new life of treasures to discover and to unpack and
Mhm.
yeah, so that's really beautiful. So you mentioned
Yeah.
about third culture kids. I was just wondering, can you qualify a little bit more? What's the kind of things that third culture kids struggle with, and what's their scope of life that I think
Hmm.
so many people are so unaware of
Yeah.
the kind of things that they come up and engaged and challenged with.
Yeah. So when you are a third culture kid, you have a sense of not really belonging anywhere. And so yeah, it's a feeling of being on the outskirts because you belong but don't belong. And so it's a sort of straddling of cultures, and it can kind of be really confusing where you don't know,
Hmm.
okay, well, I've spent these many years, I spent these 5 years in this culture, and so in order to live there, I kind of threw out these pieces of my American culture in order to live here. But when I leave this new culture that I'm in, I don't actually need all the pieces from it, but I don't want to throw all of it out either. So it's looking at what are the pieces of the culture that you were living in, that you assimilated to, what are the valuable pieces that you want to keep,
Mm,
and noticing those things as treasures
yeah.
instead of throwing them out. Like maybe you were in an an Asian culture where you take your shoes off outside the door,
Mm,
and you got used to doing that. Well, now you're in America where people maybe wear their shoes inside the house. So, you kind of think, okay, well, it here in this place where I'm living, it doesn't make sense to leave my shoes outside my door. Maybe I'm now going to
mm,
integrate, maybe, and say I'm going to have this place for my shoes to take them off in the doorstep and kind of meet the culture halfway. It's just it's a simple example, but
yeah.
it's also really significant because when you go and you really live in a place and you really become part of
Mm,
that place, you do pick up certain things, and some things aren't helpful anymore when you move
yeah.
away, but some things are really
Yeah.
valuable and beautiful and you want to keep them.
Yeah.
Another thing that's really interesting is depth of conversation.
Uh-huh.
So, third culture kids tend to skip the natural trajectory of a conversation when you get to know someone, which is sort of like, how's the weather? And,
Yeah.
what's the weather like in your country? And what's the landscape like? No, we're straight down to, you know, how. I can't even think of something right now, but they're deep personal questions.
Yeah.
What was
Mm.
it? What was your childhood like? Are your mother and father still together? Like, you know, things that
Mm-hmm.
some people would find really awkward.
Yeah.
Sometimes third
Yeah.
culture kids can just come across as really awkward.
Mm.
And it's
And this isn't even like people within the church, you know. I love
yeah,
it. This is just
yeah,
people and like passing in the street, and they'd be like, "Your
yeah.
parents still together?"
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. It's
Uh-huh.
just
Yeah.
it's a skipping
Yeah.
the normal getting to know you time. So third culture kids tend to measure a relationship based on depth rather than
Mm.
longevity,
Mm.
because
Mm.
it's a matter of, well, I just met you. I'm going to go
Mm.
deep and
Mm.
get to know you well because I don't know how much time I have with you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to
Mm.
skip all this stuff and get to know you really, really well rather
Mm.
than taking time deciding if I can actually trust you or things like that. So,
You know, I think we can also say TCKs. They also have a level of attractiveness, although. But I wanted to ask because it's true. We are. I'm also a TCK. In case you were listening and wondering, but I wanted to ask you. Um. Okay, I wanted to ask you, Luis. Shaheen, how has being a TCK affected your passion of being a teacher, as well as when you're in the classroom? Because so much about teaching is speaking into the identity of young learners. So how has that actually impacted you, your story? Um, Even with that old man who pointed his finger at you, saying who you are, how has
mm.
that played a role and effect as a teacher for you?
Okay, so this is really interesting because I didn't remember this until you just spoke it. In my second year of teaching, so I've been teaching now, this is my 10th year of teaching, 11th year. In my second year of teaching, I remember a kid drawing their self portrait. And this was an Indian girl who was drawing herself, and she took out the peach color crayon and began to color her face peach. And I said, but that's not what you look like. Now
Mm.
there's controversy around this because people would say yes, but if that's what she identifies as, then that's what she should color herself as. And but it was a trigger for me at the time. I recognize it now saying, no, but look at yourself. You are brown, right?
Mm.
Like this is what you look like. Value that. It's beautiful, right? So it automatically impacted me as a teacher in that I have been very focused on children under knowing who they are and valuing
Mm.
themselves in their uniqueness, but also seeing that we are all connected also.
Mm.
So I am, as a teacher, my philosophy is very much rooted in a social emotional approach to children and making sure that number one, they know that they're valuable people
Mm.
Mm.
just because they exist.
Yeah.
Now, becoming an international school teacher and working with third culture kids, TCKs, missionary kids, um, children who are coming and going, the international school realm is full of these children who are moving in and out, and
Mhm.
so I speaking to them and saying, hey, I know what you're going through,
Mm.
Mhm.
or say to them, or to being able to understand them better,
Mm.
because I have an emotional experience of having left my home country and gone to a new culture. Even though I was a teenager, maybe I wasn't a primary child, but I was a teenager and I know what that felt
Mm.
like. And it's not a small thing. And so it does come out in different ways in kids.
Mm.
And being able to recognize that and being able to honor the transition has been really, really helpful and it's been a
Mm.
gift for
Yeah.
me and for the children and for their parents too, because I can say, hey, I think I might know what's going on with your child right now. So
Mm.
Mm.
yeah, yeah, I don't know, that I felt like there were multiple questions, Caleb.
It
I don't know if I answered them all.
it did. I mean, I know. I think one of the things I would want to ask also, as the amazing woman that you are, how do you relate to? Because in East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, we got a lot of uh, um, second, third generation. Like you have Indian girls who are very Western,
Mhm.
very westernized. And so, what would part of your message be to them of like that identity piece? Because yeah, you're speaking in international school, so it kind of goes with what you were just speaking about. But
Mm.
I don't know if you had something specific towards that of how you would relate, or what would your message be to them, if that makes sense.
To the westernized Indian women?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I would say that just to recognize the the rift between what they may experience in their home and what they may be learning at school, versus what they may be learning in society. Because, especially when you're in an international school, it's one culture in your school, it's another culture in your home, it's another culture outside of your home in just the local community. And that is not an easy thing to navigate.
No.
Um, and I would say the most difficult thing to do as a young woman or man, in general, in any community where you're living between different standards, is to honor your parents.
Mm,
That's the hardest thing to do.
Mm.
And it's really it's just really hard because of the fact that it's a different mindset. You have a different worldview
Mm.
than your parents might, or that maybe the people in your wherever you're worshiping at might have a different worldview. And so balancing it is really hard. And so what I have to say is that I see you,
mhm,
like, that you're not alone, and that if anybody says, "Oh, well, just get over it," you can look at them and say, "Actually, I happen to know that this is not easy. And what I'm doing is not a small thing."
mhm,
Um, because I think what happens is that people feel like when they're stuck between worlds that they're not recognized for being stuck between those worlds. And so the
mhm,
first thing is to recognize, number one, that you're not alone, but that also you just have to you have to work within the parameters that you're at. So
Mm.
you can't be totally don't go totally rebellious,
Yeah.
because it doesn't work. I definitely tried it,
What?
did that.
I thought
Uh,
you were perfect.
no.
What? You just look so perfect.
No,
Oh,
I'm
the
definitely not.
deception. Oh, okay, now
It's a
I understand.
deception. No, I went off the deep end for a long time. I
Mhm,
really, really got really lost, and all that time that I was in, studying Catholicism and studying New Age stuff and shamanism, and even on before I got on the Buddha path, I was just really off the deep end. I was doing drugs. I battled with all kinds of addiction,
Mm.
every
would you
kind of
say
addiction.
during that time, what culture would you identify yourself with? Or would you say you're kind of just culturalist?
Yeah.
Like when you're kind of figuring out where you're at, were you this American that's just off the deep end? Were you Indian? How did you? Yeah,
So I didn't identify as anything, and I think that that was the problem.
come on.
I think that the issue was is that I was rejecting parts of myself,
Yeah.
and that when you reject parts of yourself and you cut yourself off from the
That's it.
source,
Mm.
which is the love of God,
Mm.
you reject parts of yourself. God made you on purpose. He specifically designed us.
Yeah.
And so when
Yes.
we reject parts of ourself, which is actually who we are supposed to be, we were designed on purpose, and we reject that purposefully made being,
Yeah.
Come on.
then you end up going running amok.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
run amok.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that is what I did. So when I speak to the people who are struggling with identity and who they are and where they're going or who they belong to, I would say that rejection of any part of yourself is disastrous.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
It is the opposite of what I would recommend. It creates a f- it creates lines in your life, like
That's it.
these crevices, these
Mm.
huge gaping holes where
Wow.
you just fall into them and you feel like you can't get out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what happened for me is that I finally became open to allowing God to fill those places. And I know I talk about God a lot, and for people who are just like, okay, here she goes again. It's because I really did try every other way, and there was no other healing for it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
you know?
Um, I think even to sum up one of the phrases is when we rob God of who He's created to be, like, we're really robbing ourselves when we
Mhm.
are picking and choosing. I know for a lot of the people that have come on and we've been able to hear their stories, it's been that similar thing. One of our dear sisters, Caitlin, hashtag, shout out to her. She's awesome, but she's Cuban American, and exact same thing. You know, growing up as this, she's Latina, but she's also American. But there are bits and pieces of her story that she would choose, and how that
Mhm.
affected her.
Mhm.
Same for me. I'm, how I grew up, and so I think that has been something that has been such a significant thing in the world we live in the day and age, where people will not want to choose the white side because they're like,
Mm.
oh, this is all the evilness that has happened,
Mm.
and
Right.
so they totally reject that.
Yeah.
And as you
Mm.
said, because I know we have people who listen who they can relate to that, and
Mhm.
it's then it gets to that awkward stage of, oh, how could I stand on behalf of this people when they've done that? But the beautiful thing is, as someone who knows their identity as a son or a daughter of the High King,
Mm.
Mhm.
that we can actually stand in that place,
Yeah.
as hard and awkward and as uncomfortable as it may be. We can stand in that place and ask for forgiveness. And we
Yeah.
can actually start to be the hands and feet of reconciliation. And
Yeah.
so, honestly, for those that would be listening, I would say a story like Shaheen's, where you choose. It's not the best to choose what you want. I mean, who God created you to be. Like she said, it's God created you on purpose, and so that is your vehicle of reconciliation. When you start
Mm.
accepting the different culture, different aspects of who you are.
Mm.
Um, but Yoshi,
Mhm.
that's
Yeah.
amazing. That's I really like hearing
I
that part.
think, yeah, just this
Mhm.
past week I also taught in a class, and it's so significant if you read through the word, then how God really before the foundations of the earth had you in mind and chose for you to born in a time such as this, and
Mhm.
Mm,
sovereignly chose who's the family you're going to be born in. And I think God is so specific in the things that He chose, and allowed us to be born in a time and a season. And the things that happen in our stories is part of the gift that what God wants to release through us to the world,
Yeah.
and to bless other people, and to help them navigate things. And I think your story is so significant, and there's
mm,
so many people that
amen.
that really can bring life. And I think maybe you haven't even
Mhm.
started to really discover and walk it out in the fullness of it, because sometimes we tend to end up in situations that you don't always get the opportunity to really see it from a different
Hmm.
perspective.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really beautiful. I sort of
Thank you.
stopped you a little bit in the beginning when you wanted to continue about your journey, your faith
No, it's
journey. So
okay.
if there's something that you really want to add that can benefit people to that, highlight this a little bit more, yeah, please feel free to speak and share about that.
Yeah, it's funny. I realized I just kept talking. I was like, "Oh, I hope people are still listening."
They are,
'Cause
Shaheen,
they are.
what?
I just kept going. But I really find that every time I tell my story, it helps me own
Mm.
it more. And
True.
yes, I really was a woman who struggled with every type of addiction. I really was that quintessential lost woman. I was confused. I was searching for something constantly and never finding it, and really damaging my life, damaging myself, not loving myself. And I think that, that also came out of a place of me in my life, with all due respect to my parents and all due respect to all of the parents that, might be listening. All of our parents come with their own baggage, and everybody
Yeah.
tries. Um, and we're all broken people. We're all people who are trying to become the best of ourselves. But our parents are, of course, not perfect either, and so we all suffer from certain things that come from them.
Yeah.
And my family, I came from a family where I did experience a lot of trauma as a child, and that actually was most of the source of things. And somebody actually asked me the source of why I got so lost. Somebody said to me, Shaheen, do you think that if you grew up in a really loving family and that you were supported in all of these things, do you think that you would have found God in the same way?
Mm.
And I said, wow, that's a really intense question. And I said, we we have to remember that God looks at us and the individuals that we are, and takes us on the journey, allows the journey to happen, and works with us where we're at. And so, Him knowing how stubborn I am and how experiential I am, I had to go through those things to be able to find God in the way that I did. I was in, and I really believe that because I went through all of those things, I can sit here and say without a shadow of a doubt, I the love of God is what heals all
True.
things. And the way that we can experience the love of God is through Jesus. And so, how did I lose my aversion to Jesus? Well, I was actually at a meditation course. I was sitting in a meditation course, a 10-day meditation course, watching a video of an Indian man named SN Goenka. So, those of you who know Vipassana meditation, I'm sure there are people who are Vipassana meditators. And so I was listening to SN Goenka, and he said, why do people have such a problem with Jesus being the Son of God?
Mm.
It's like, I think it's day 3 of the discourse or something, day 3 or something like this. And every evening you listen to him, and he was, all of a sudden he starts talking about Jesus, and I thought, why is this Indian man talking about Jesus? But he said, why do people have such a problem with this? I mean, at the end of his life, I mean, he was being crucified. And as he was being crucified, all he could say was, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. He was full of goodwill and compassion and love and forgiveness. What is God? God is goodwill and compassion and love and forgiveness. Clearly, he is a son of God. And in that moment, I lost my aversion
Mm.
to Jesus being the Son of God. I
Sure.
opened up to the possibility. And so once that happened, it sort of fast forwarded into moving from the what felt at the time like an isolation of the Buddha path, because in the Buddha path you don't have a devotional practice. And because I got so quiet and I was in creation so much, I really wanted to devote myself. I
Mm.
wanted a devotional practice. I wanted to praise
Yeah.
this being, whatever it was that made this world, because it's so miraculous. I felt that was, I wanted to sing and to love this whatever it was that made this. And I realized I knew my whole life that it was God.
Mm.
God made the world. And being in silence and being in the quiet really is what got me there. So if you ever are confused, and I say this to the people who are listening, getting quiet in nature is the best way to figure out who you are and
Mm.
who God is.
Mm.
Um, in my experience. And so, yeah, one thing led to another. My friend, who was going through divorce at the time, and I had been through a divorce, so she was going to me for support, and I was supporting her. I hadn't been to church in a long time, and she said to me, "Hey, I'm going to church this evening. It's a message about forgiveness." And out of support to her,
Yeah.
I went with her to church. And when I went
Little
there,
did you know.
little did I know that I was going to be broken wide open. I mean,
Yeah.
the message was just that they said, this is what God's love looks like, that
Come
you
on.
are loved because you were born. And I just bawled. I bawled. I cried for,
Can you reenact it?
no, I don't
Okay.
think I could, but I cried and
Mm,
cried. So, that's it. There's so much more to the story, of how things happened and when they happened. I mean,
mhm,
I would say that now this has been a for sure, like a 23-year journey. I'm 42 now.
Mm,
So it really has been, I would say, since I was, of course, a lifetime journey, but I remember being 18 years old and graduating high school, 19 years old, turning 19. And at that time, when I felt like my life completely fell apart after
mhm,
that, and trying to pick up the pieces slowly but surely. And granted, yes, I have seen therapists and greatly appreciate the aunties, mothers, professional
mm.
women who have supported me in being able to navigate all of the stuff, all of the crap that I went through. But in the end, it really is, it's just the love of God, and that's what really heals all things.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
Shaheen, sorry, this. I just want to ask a really quick question. I mean, first and foremost, amazing what you've just shared, and I don't want to skim that lightly. That's actually phenomenal. I wanted to ask you. I know time is running out, but how do your parents now? Who do they see you as?
Mm,
As you're called? Like, do they see this young Indian woman, like how with everything we've spoken previously with
Mm,
culture and stuff.
mm.
If is there a way you could try to sum a bit of that up of just how do they see you now? Obviously, you are a Jesus lover. I know a bit of your story. Um, you are annoying about it, which is good. We want to be annoying for Jesus. So yeah, if you could briefly try to share a bit of that.
I would say that I honestly don't know how they see me.
Hmm.
I know though that my parents love me, and that is something that I
Amen.
don't think I really knew before. But I know now when I interact with them that they have respect for me,
mm,
that they
Mm,
see a change in me, um, that they know that whatever it is that I'm doing has a significant impact on on my life, just
mhm,
that whatever I'm worshiping, however I'm worshiping, it gives me so much peace,
mm,
and they can
mhm,
see that,
mm.
and that has a ripple effect on them. But how do they see me? Do they see me as an Indian woman? Do they see me as an American woman? They just see me as Shaheen.
Yeah.
They see me as
mhm,
me. And
Mm,
I think that's I had never ever thought about that, Caleb, because once I gave in and said, my identity is a child of God,
mm,
mhm.
I believe they see me as their kid, and they
Come on.
know that I see myself as God's kid. So
Yeah,
mm,
that's
beyond
good.
that,
mm,
I don't have any other,
mm.
I don't have any ideas.
Mm,
I don't know.
mhm. Wow.
Yeah.
When I asked for a little bit feedback before the interview, you said, I'm most passionate right now about people who feel that they are too far gone to be loved. And I think that's a good way to
Mm,
end our conversation.
yeah, I mean, my heart breaks for people who think that they've done too many things to be forgiven,
Mm,
because I did that. In these years, like I said, this has been like a
oh,
23-year journey, and in that time, I've already been married, I'm divorced, I've done things that I wouldn't just speak in a podcast because it's
mm,
kind of not appropriate, but they're deep things.
mm,
And so you can use your imagination as a listener what those things
mm,
could be. And I really know what it is to sit there and think, I'm not worth it. I'm not a person who has any future, or I'm not a person who anybody's going to care about, because I know myself and I know the things I've done. And what I want to say to those people is that there is never a time when you have done something so wrong that God can't love you.
Mhm.
So I really want to say that again. There is never a time in your life when you have done something so bad that you are not still lovable by God
Yeah.
and also the people around you. They may not have the capacity, but you're still lovable and likable and worthy of appreciation because you exist. Now, does that mean that you might not have some cleaning up to do? Probably. I mean, we all do. But the essence is that you're worthy of existence, and that
Wow.
your life has meaning, not just for yourself, but also can touch other
Yes, for
people.
sure.
Sheen, that's phenomenal. And honestly, our greatest hope, uh, first and foremost, you said you're 42. Y'all, I know you can't see this, but she don't look like she's 42. I don't even know what 42 look like. But Shaheen, you're so youthful in your heart as well. And honestly, even just that last bit of your vulnerability where you state, yeah, you've been through life, you've gone through stuffs, and yet I know when I met you, I never would have imagined such things because of how much you've thrown yourself into Jesus's arms.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be my encouragement and testament here for all that would listen, that you are an example of someone who has literally just given yourself
Mm-hmm.
wholehearted to Jesus. It's
Mm-hmm.
so evidently clear. The way you have determined the way you want to live your life, what you watch, what you listen to, how you interact with others. I've seen it. And so honestly, we can only trust that God would let this podcast fall into the right ears.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe that with what you have shared, you've shared with an authority because you have walked it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I meant when I said earlier, you walk the talk.
Mm-hmm.
So honestly, sis, or Miss Shaheen, as your students would call you, you are such an example.
It's all God. And and that's the thing, is that we cannot do this in our own power. It's not possible for us as humans. There's no way that I could have pulled myself out of that pit.
Wow, I learned so much through this conversation with Shaheen. For me, she colored the picture of being a third culture kid. Follow us on the platform you listen to, and do not miss our forthcoming episodes.